Sometimes it can feel like a fight to convince other people that your child is worthy of being included. And when we do that, we forget that big picture, that there are no prerequisites to being included. And yet, as parents and even teachers often, there are so many gatekeepers that we see along the way that we get frustrated. We struggle to keep trying to send the message that inclusive education really does work. So today we have a guest with us that is going to help us get back in touch with, yes, inclusive education is not only a research-based practice and evidence-based practice, but it is the right thing for us to do with all students. So let me bring our guest in and add Tim to the stream. And it's kind of like I just caught you taking a bite of a donut, but no, it was a sip of coffee.
It's actually tea.
Oh, that's our tea.
It's still caffeine, though.
Welcome, Tim. And I think a lot of our viewers probably know you, Tim, from your podcast, Think Inclusive. And also that, I don't know, kind of recently, you became the Director of Communications for the Maryland Coalition of Inclusive Education. So we are happy that you are here today. One of the things that Tim and I have in common is that we were both special education teachers in a self-contained classroom. So I guess we're proof, Tim, that we can all keep evolving, right? And we don't have to stay at where we were when we entered the education field. But Tim, welcome. And what else would you like to share with our audience about yourself that maybe they don't know?
Well, I'm pretty much out there on the web, on the socials. I put myself out there. I've been putting myself out there for a while. In case you didn't know, some things that I love to do. I love to run. In fact, this afternoon I'm running with my daughter, who is 9 years old. We are running a 3K, which I didn't even know that was a thing. Normally it's 5K, but we're running a 3K this Saturday down in Atlanta on the Beltline. Actually, if you know the Atlanta area, there is a walking path that goes around the perimeter of the city of Atlanta. It was designed by a Georgia Tech master's student, and they've been kind of filling it in over the last number of years. So there's going to be a race on the north side of the Beltline. So that's where we're going to be. Love that. What else? I love music. I'm a former musician. Love to read. And I love inclusion.
All right.
Is why I'm here, Charmaine.
Yes. And you probably think and dream inclusion, right?
Yeah. Yes.
It becomes our world, right?
All the time. Yeah.
Well, we have people that have submitted questions, so we'll go through some of those. But I also want to encourage folks to, say hi. Karen likes my new makeup. Yes. Oh, Kim is here. Good. Kim had a question, so we'll make sure that Kim's question gets in here. And we will start by, let me see if I can pull up the first question. So we had somebody ask, what are inclusive districts doing that's working versus those who silo students into self-contained classrooms?
Great question. I like to start talking about inclusion with, there's kind of four big areas that we like to talk about. And I want to first give huge props to Michael McSheehan and Cheryl Jorgensen for the Beyond Access model of membership, participation, and learning. Yeah, there we go.
Yes.
I need a horn.
Yeah.
I need a reggae horn or something. Ding, ding, ding. Because that's how we really define inclusive education. But for how we frame it at MCIE is really number one, placement. So that is one of the biggest differences to what actual authentically, schools that are authentically including students, is that they're actually in the classrooms, Charmaine.
What a concept.
Yes, yes. And I will say, in the most inclusive districts, you're looking at 90% LREA, or an inclusive placement rate. Now,
Um,
there's not too many of them. And I will say, not the percentage is just a number. So that's why you have the rest of, that's why you have the beyond access, because, the number is the only thing that is measured across all states and all districts. So,
right.
you can't look in Georgia schools and say, okay, what's the membership, rate? What's the participation rate? What's the learning rate? Those are really qualitative factors that would require a lot of effort. I think that they should be done, but at this point, it's not measured. What is
Right.
measured is placement. And so we know, with the districts that we work with and that we know about, 90% of
Um,
students are included. And then when you think about membership, the Ties Center has a fantastic resource written by Eric Carter. In fact, I was going to share this with, I wonder if I can do this. Can I share this with you in the
yeah, you
private
can
chat?
share your screen. So if you click on the icon near the bottom where it says share, under your picture.
Let me see if I can do this.
Are you thinking of the graphic of belonging?
Yes,
Where
I am.
I love that. I know. And I'll have to put the link for that in our show notes. But yeah, see if you can pull that up.
Here we go. Oh, look at that. Charmaine, this is the first time I've used this live format, so I'm really excited about this.
Yes, it works. It
It
works.
works, yes. So big props and shout out to the Ties Center and Eric Carter for creating this resource. Again, I don't want everyone to go dizzy with the scrolling, but there is, I wonder if this might bring the visual. Let's see, here we go. This is a great
Yes,
visual.
I love that.
I think this is a great visual when we talk about belonging. Now, I'm no expert in belonging, so I wouldn't be able to, talk about it the way Eric Carter. But I think that this is just a way to point to that membership and belonging is part of inclusive education and part of what inclusive schools do.
Right. And I think, to me, what I love is, if you start kind of near the 12 o'clock time there where it says present, that blue section.
Mm-hmm.
And to me, that's like, your child is in the general education classroom. But what I love is there's so many other dimensions of belonging. And I'm not sure that, I don't think it's, necessarily linear that you have to go through each one of these phases. But when I look at the purple one next to present and it says needed, to me, that is like when our kids are seen as contributors and not like, oh, we're going to do this because it's nice and we're going to have some socialization. But
Mm-hmm.
for us to get to the point where our kids feel like they are needed, it's not just, they're sitting there in a classroom.
Yeah. So I'm going to stop sharing for a second, and then I might share again because that was super fun.
Cool.
So the kind of the next thing we talk about is participation. So what is everyone doing in the class, right? So like you said, they're not in the corner or in the back doing something that is, so they may have placement, right? maybe they feel like they belong, or maybe they feel like they belong in the community, but what actually are they doing when they're in the classroom?
Right.
And so there is a great video by I can't remember the name right now. It's from Australia. It's called "What is Inclusion." I have a link for you.
Oh, good.
And it goes. I'm prepared with links. Let's just say that.
You're the link man.
I'm the link man. So it shows a really great representation of a student, kind of in the uh, the being segregated, excluded, maybe integrated, but not actually doing what everyone's doing, and then finally showing them included in the classroom. Down syndrome, Queensland. It's called "What is Inclusion," and I will copy
Okay.
this and put it in the private chat so
Oh,
that
good.
you can
Yeah,
share
and
that
I
with
can
your
make
audience.
sure. Yeah, I can post that, and also I'll put that in our show notes that will be coming
Yes.
out tomorrow morning for people. So this is a link to the video. Great. I don't think I've seen that.
Yeah, so we've been doing a lot of workshops around shared vision of inclusive education, and I was planning on talking about this later, and we certainly can delve more into it. But that's one of the most important things to do when trying to make change in a school building, is to develop some shared vision. Because when I was a classroom teacher, and I knew what I meant when I said inclusive education. But when I was talking to my principal, or when I was talking to my speech language pathologist, or when I was even talking to my family, my families that I worked with, everyone kind of had a different idea of what that meant, right? And so creating that shared vision and communicating that vision to the staff from the leadership is so important, because if you don't have that, you're going to be spinning your wheels.
Yes, yes. And you'll be in for a fight. And we're going to say no more fighting so I can peel these off. Okay. I feel better now.
All right. There was a lot of comments, so I'm not sure if
I
there's
know. So
anything you
we'll
feel like
see
I
here.
need to address.
Let's see. Andrea's saying, how do we as parents get included in developing that vision?
Well, I think it starts with having a vision that's articulated to the team about your child. You know, because the vast majority of school districts, I think, don't have a shared vision, right? So what you want to do is have that vision. A lot of times in IEPs, parents will actually write out a statement or a vision statement for their child and present it to the team and say, look, this is the vision that we have. And we want you to buy in and share with our vision. So something that we do too, that isn't really in the systemic change part or the work that we do, but we do for MCIE, we do individual student planning or person-centered planning. And that takes a family with the school district and the school team through person-centered questions, a MAPS meeting, and what are your dreams and hopes for your child? What does the child, or what does the student, what do they want out of their life? And then as you move through the steps of the MAPS meeting and through the person-centered planning, you come up with a where is the student going to be working on certain skills, or how they're going to fulfill their dreams in the school, in general education. So it's a really useful tool that we use to help include students who have been historically marginalized. And that's really at the student level or the family level. We also do like more systemic work that is at the district level.
Yeah, and I think I would love IEP processes, the process of an IEP meeting, to be more influenced by person-centered planning. Um, that process I find just it's so much more of a positive way of looking at things. The other thing that I love when I used to facilitate person-centered planning meetings was my rule was you had to have as many students as adults. Because to me, that flavor of student voice, it makes a tremendous difference. And we can do that with IEP meetings. When my son got older, like fifth grade, we started inviting friends to his meetings. But yeah, person-centered planning, if folks don't know about it, and again, I can put some information in the show notes, but I love that's part of your process that you're using with the coalition. I think that's a great idea.
Yeah. So while we're talking about change, I think that's part of the process of change, right? So, having a shared vision for inclusive education, what that actually means, that's communicated from the top down, right? And then when you're communicating this vision, um, roles and responsibilities are going to change, right? Because it's no longer you have a student with a disability in the back of the room with a paraprofessional working on something else, right? Or the special education teachers are only teaching students with disabilities in a pull-out resource room, right? The roles are different. So special education teachers and general education teachers share in the responsibilities of teaching all students. And that's a big shift. Now, a lot of districts are already there. A lot of districts have co-teaching. But, there's more to co-teaching than just having a special and a general education teacher in a classroom, right? So it's really kind of digging in and figuring out how are we actually going to deliver instruction and services. And then there's scheduling. So scheduling is a huge part of this systemic change. And with the districts that we work with, it takes a number of years to kind of get it to so that the school feels like they are distributing students in natural proportions in a way that is beneficial for everyone. So scheduling is huge. Then I'm not sure if you mentioned it, but collaboration time, right? Again, with roles and responsibilities, those are going to change. So it means that at some point, people are going to have to talk to each other and plan for the success of students. And someone's going to have to figure out when that's going to be, right? And I can't tell you that it has to happen at lunch, or it has to happen after school, or it happen before school, or it has to be every other week, like the school team and the district and the building that they have to figure that out. And so then after all of those layers, then you have individual student planning, which kind of ties everything together, because for some students who educators are going, I have no idea how we're going to include this student. I want to, I have the mindset, I have, I'm working on my anti-ableist, anti-racist, point of view. So I'm ready to do the work, but just the how part of it. When a student has real complex support needs or communication needs, like, when is this going to happen? Who's going to, do this? Who's going to do that? So that the planning and the MAPS meetings really, really help and assist that.
Oh, for sure. I'm thinking of another TIES article. I think it's called 15, 30, 45. And
Yep.
it's like if you only have 15 minutes to collaborate, this is what you want to focus on. And then another good resource for that, I think, is Paula Cluth and Julie Costin's co-teaching book. And
Hmm.
they have some good information and tips in there about, having more stand-up meetings where you make it quick because not everybody wants to be standing that long, but how to fit in some collaboration time. So, yeah, that's going to be critical, right, for the classroom teacher to feel successful and supported, and for the kids to feel successful and supported. Um, and we had a comment here from Karen. I'm going to put up. Karen is a trailblazer in Colorado. And she says, I've been spending some time online in spaces for teachers. The comments in these spaces lean very negatively in how they feel about parents in general and students with IEPs who have behaviors in the classroom. I get that they may not have all the structural support they need to meet all the students' needs, but it seems like they really resent having our kids in their classrooms. And so, Tim, I don't know with your work with the Maryland Coalition for Inclusive Ed, because I know you have certain districts that you work with. Is that something that comes up as far as, kind of those conflicts between teachers and parents and how we see each other?
Yeah, yeah, and we are all humans. So, you know, resentment and conflict, especially when people are pressed, right? Um, Pressed and stressed. um, um, and so it's not just you have educators who are feeling pressed and stressed, and so sometimes that comes out on either students or families. Then you also have families and students who are pressed and stressed, and that comes out on teachers. And so I think there's a lot of grace that needs to happen. And that's certainly a lot easier to say than to do. But as far as you asked specifically about districts that we work with, there's always going to be uh, some conflict, but hopefully we have some structures in place to resolve conflict. And then one of the things, when I want to go back to systemic change, right? And I want to go back to having a vision and sharing that vision, and consistently communicating how we should be thinking about all learners. Um, so what I would like to see is that even if there is some conflict, that the leadership knows when to step in and say, I understand that maybe you feel like you're not supported. We're going to help you. I understand that you may feel, um, like you are at your wit's end, but like this is your job. So one of the things that we see is administration, school administration, so principals, support staff, and then also district administration. They know when to come in and say, this is not okay, and we need you to do this, whatever this is, right?
Right.
So, and that's not necessarily just an inclusion thing, right? It could be any number of things in a school building that an administration has to do for educators. So, but I appreciate that question.
Yeah, and I think that is important because I think sometimes as parents we feel like the administrators support the teachers and that we still feel like our voice is left out.
Mm,
One of the things that I think is really helpful that parents can do is to give teachers permission to make mistakes.
yeah.
Um, And especially I think when we have a reputation as that parent, of a parent that's going to be speaking up and speaking out, it can make more teachers feel uncomfortable, and defensive. And so, I would try to tell teachers, when Dylan was born, I didn't know what to do with a baby with Down syndrome. I had to learn, and I made mistakes, and I recognize at school that it's going to be a challenge. There's new things that we're going to be asking each other to do. So I think giving them permission to make mistakes, as long as we take that time to reflect right after the mistake and figure out what we're going to change next time. But sometimes it just, the more that we can get to know people as individuals, then I think the more we see each other kind of coming towards that middle and getting an understanding that we can both support. But it is important. And I know, Andrea was saying that, yes, we do share the vision, but our vision is not shared by the team. And that's where I think, Tim, when you're talking about that shared vision, we need all the voices to define that, but it's got to be supported by the superintendent, the Board of Education, the central office, in order for that to have hopes of trickling down. So to me, it's like we can do this grassroots level of allies for inclusion, and we also can get that top-down support. But it's almost like we need both of those. I don't know if that's what you see or not.
Oh yeah, I definitely, so like, when I was a classroom teacher, I was advocating for my students to be included. I also had families, and I knew of families in the district that I work with that were advocating for inclusion. And sometimes they were successful. And by success, I mean mostly placement. And then the family and, whoever was advocating had certain success at, that membership participation and learning. But it wasn't perfect, right? And for the students that were successful, they would move on to another teacher or another, school. And that school had no context. They didn't know what went on in elementary school, or maybe it was middle to high school. They didn't know what was going on in the middle school. And it was like starting all over, because the principal didn't share the vision, right? So I think we do need both. I think we need educators, even those that are in self-contained classrooms right now, because let me tell you what, I still feel like the majority of special education teachers, especially ones that work with students with more complex support needs, are in self-contained segregated settings. Where else are they going to be, right? So we need educators to be advocating for change, but we also need for district representatives to be making that change as well. What's really interesting is I talk with a lot of directors of special education and assistant superintendents and principals. In fact, we were just in Oklahoma. I think this is a great example. And Carol Quirk, who is our CEO, and myself, we talked with a high school principal in Oklahoma. And he heard us talk about, placement, membership, participation, and learning, about changing roles and responsibilities, about the why, the what and the how of inclusion. And he's like, I am all in, right? But he's like, but how do I get people on board? And this is a principal. and so it made me hopeful, though, because I think that more often than not, you have people in administration, and when they see what we're talking about with inclusive education, they're like, oh yeah, of course I want that. Of course I want that. But okay, now how do we do it? Right? How do we do it? And a lot of it is principals going, well, how am I going to convince my assistant superintendent? Or how am I going to convince my superintendent? How am I going to convince my school board? How am I going to convince my parents?
Right.
Because, for however long we've been telling parents that what's best for kids is to segregate them into special education, disability specific programs. And now we have to say, now we're saying, oh, oops. No, what we really meant, what's really best for them is an inclusive education. And they're like, what?
Right. Oh, exactly. And I know that's a common question that, that I hear. And I know this was a question that Karen also had from where she was talking about how do we start that conversation with parents that aren't proponents of inclusion and that do feel that their child is safe in learning in a segregated room, and they are not on board with this inclusive education.
Yeah.
So how do we have that conversation with parents, and what are some of the things that maybe we can say when we're having that dialogue?
I did not come up with this. It was Sarah Jo Soldivari and Janice Fialka. They were guests on our podcast, and we were asking a very similar question. And Janice, put it so nicely when she said, well, first we have to listen. We have to listen, and we have to understand why this is the thing that families want. And so when you dig down into why, there's a lot of talk about safety, right? And personal attention, making sure that they're not lost in the cracks, and accountability. There's a lot of reasons why a family. It's not because they want to segregate their students. In fact, I doubt that they'd want to use that language. We use that language because we want to be, or I want to be, I want it to be thought provoking, right? That's why I use it. When I was a teacher, people didn't like it.
I know.
But so listening and then asking questions about like, well, what is it that is your concern if your child was in an inclusive class? Like, what is the biggest thing what's the biggest concern? And then talk about it and talk and have real talk. I had a conversation with Michael McSheehan. He was a podcast guest. And I asked him, do you think that sometimes segregated special education or special schools are better than inclusive education done badly or without support? And he surprised me with his answer. He said that sometimes being in a special school or in a special classroom is better, because if you're in a spot where everyone is miserable because inclusive education isn't being supported, then what's the end game? What's the outcome? Right? Everyone is suffering. It doesn't mean you stay there. It doesn't mean that you don't stop advocating. But I thought his point was, I thought he had a good point. And it's one that I think that we should be real about, have real talk about it, so because again, I'm not in your family. If your family has made the decision and advocated for a separate classroom, I can't make that decision for you. I can't make that decision for you. And even when we are, Carol and I were just talking about this, when we're going through systemic change, the process of change in a district, it's incremental, right? It's not, okay, everyone's included next year. We start with a grade level. We start with, if there's 20 schools, we start with 4.
Oh,
Right? Or if there's
right,
50 schools, we start with 8 or something. There's no
right,
real formula, but it's incremental, right? It's year after year after year after year, and we build capacity because we don't want to just all of a sudden change practices and say, okay, see you, bye.
right, right.
Um, and so when we go through that process, sometimes parents are like, no, I do not want my student to go to their home school. I want them to stay in the regional program
Sure,
or autism class or intellectual disability class or behavior class or whatever, because
sure.
I want them to feel supported, right? But the idea is that as we're moving through a district and changing practices from the top down and the bottom up, that
Right.
the family will say, oh, well, that's what you meant, and then they'll be able to be supported.
Well, yeah, and I think, I have Sarah Joe's voice in my head saying, that the worst inclusive experience in a general ed classroom is going to be better than an experience in a segregated classroom. So, we are united in our vision for inclusive education. And even with the supporters of that, you will find different people have different opinions, right? And different experiences. And I think a lot of times parents have bought into the myths about inclusion. And so that is why they're looking at, no, I want the special ed room. But I think you're right that we have to respect where people are coming from, but also try to have that conversation, because what's helpful for me sometimes is to look at what the big goal is. So, like, what is that big goal that parents have? How do they see their children after high school? So, if that's our North Star, um, how are we going to get there? And then we look. So, having your child spend most of their day in a special education classroom, is that going to be giving him a step closer to that future, that North Star that we're looking at? And look at what are the ways that we can get there, and how can we make sure that we respond to the parent concerns of safety? I think parents are sometimes disillusioned that a segregated class is safer. I mean, we have a lot of restraint and seclusion that goes on at
Oh,
segregated classes. So, I think showing parents there's another side to this, and we need to, be, like I said, having that dialogue, because the fears that parents have, and they think that the special ed room is going to be a better placement, sometimes is based on myths, and those are the myths that we need to you know dismantle and start with anew. But another thing that Andrea had said here was, um, how do we start organizing for change at the district level? Any tools you can provide to moms that want to organize and try to get others to join our inclusion bandwagon?
Well, I would ask Andrea, is there any is there is there any group that's already organizing in your particular district? And if there isn't, then I would start a group. Either it's a Facebook group or a meetup group, because what I'm seeing, and I can't remember if we talked about this, Charmaine, before, but you know, people advocating at school board meetings can make things happen. And if you have a critical mass of people, it's hard to ignore. So I would start assembling your critical mass. And in my local area, there is a group of families who have children with Down syndrome. That's their critical mass. Um, you know, it it could just be people for inclusive education. I would love to see more local grassroots groups just meeting on a regular basis, saying we all want the same thing, right? So I think that is where you start. So if you're a family, or a family member, or a community member, or if you're an educator, if we can get all those people together that are local and just start talking about what do we want, right? I think that is a positive movement. And then develop a structure, right? When you meet, what are you doing? We're watching a video and then discussing what it means. We're going to do a book study. We are going to write a list and divvy up all of the school board members' names and emails and develop a letter to send. Like, those are just very simple things, but I think that we need more grassroots level advocacy.
Oh, exactly. And I think a perfect example is what's been happening in Billings, Montana,
Yes,
with
yes.
the collective advocacy that has changed the school district policy, not only for students with disabilities, but other students also. Um, and that's exciting news, because that's exactly what happened. I mean, the community rallied. It was kind of an impromptu thing. It wasn't, they hadn't been meeting a lot before and planning things, but yeah, that collective advocacy is critical. And I love your ideas about, getting that critical mass. I call it widening our circle of allies. There are a lot of teachers that are in support of inclusive education. There are parents of kids without disabilities that would like to see, universal design for learning. So there are ways that we can capture other allies, not just parents of disabled kids.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, I think it's really important. And I did a recent show about advocating at this, at the school board level. So I can put that link in there too. But yeah, thanks. I think that's what we need to do. I spend so much time helping parents individually advocate for their children. And yet it's like, you know, this is very slow when we do it one child at a time.
Yes,
And
yes,
we
yes.
need to start looking at going back to our roots of the parents that worked together in the 70s to make change come. So,
Mhm.
yeah, I appreciate that. I was going to look for another question here that we had. Um, so this is a question. It says, are there best practices for collaboration when asking special ed teachers and service providers to do push-in services instead of pull-out? And the person said, I feel like one of the biggest barriers is them not wanting to step on the toes of the classroom teacher. Another barrier may be just finding time for collaborative planning. And we touched on this a bit when we talked about, like Ty's article on 5:30:45. But what do you have? Do you have anything else to add, Tim, especially when we're looking at how can our related service providers start doing more push-in services instead of pull-out?
Yeah, I feel like we have talked about this. A lot of the redefining roles and responsibilities, I think, touches on this. Uh, the, you know the um, My students, our students, your students. There's a great book. Let me grab it. Hold on.
Oh, good. right at your fingertips.
Let me show you. I'm gonna plug this book. I don't know if you can see it. Your students, my students, our students.
Cool. I don't know this book. I know it's hard with the glass.
I don't know
So,
if I can take it off. Hold on, let me see if I can. I don't know if I can virtual background. Nope,
oh,
it's not letting me do it. I don't know why. But this is by Leanne Young, Nancy. I think it's Fry, Douglas Fisher,
oh,
and
Doug
Julie.
Fisher and Nancy Fry. Yes, yes.
Yes. So we've been using this with some school districts, and it is fantastic. I
Oh,
cannot
good.
recommend this highly enough. And it's pretty short. It's 140 pages.
Say the
And
title again, and I'll
it's
type it
called,
in here.
sure, it's Your Students, My Students, Our Students, Rethinking Equitable and Inclusive Classrooms.
Okay.
Um, and I've been meaning to ask Leanne, Nancy, and Doug and Julie to be on the podcast because I really, this is honestly, it's so reader friendly and nice. I mean, of course, there's lots of other books, but this was really great. They have some nice visuals to help reimagine what roles and responsibilities are. So really useful, especially for educators to kind of speak their language on how we actually do this.
Right, right. Well, and thank you, because those are the kind of the nuts and bolts that really help, I think, staff look at how can we change and how can we do things differently.
Mm-hmm.
Because you can have staff that have the mindset and the values of inclusive education, and yet they're still trying to figure out, well, what does this really look like? How do you really do this? So I think your suggestions today are going to be really helpful for parents and educators to share with their school districts. So thank you for sharing that. That'll be great.
Of course.
um So let me see here if I can find another question. And I like Michelle's comment here. Michelle's from a Trailblazer in Nebraska, and she says, as a story collector, I've heard enough stories. It's time for action. And
So I absolutely agree, Michelle. And as someone who's a communicator or who tries to do their best with communicating, I think that one of the things is getting the stories in front of the people, in front of the right people, right? Because stories do change mindsets. But if all we're doing is listening to stories, especially if we already have the mindset, right, it can feel like we're going nowhere. So one of the things that I hope to contribute to with Think Inclusive, the blog, podcast, MCIE, is to try and get in front of people who wouldn't normally, want to read about disability, ableism, inclusion, education, whatever it is.
right. And I appreciate the fact that I think maybe we start at that story level, and then we say, okay, now what's our action step going to be, right?
Yeah.
Because that's critical for people to know, like, yes, it was good that we had this book club and we talked about what we change and what it can look like, and now as a book club, what are we going to do to take that first step?
Mm-hmm.
And that's where I think too, like when you're talking about when you had suggested that we have a structure for what we're doing and what we're looking at. But going back to something that you said at the beginning of our conversation about making sure that we have that shared vision.
Mm-hmm.
And that can be something that your critical mass of people take on, as far as a first action step is let's develop, at least for the people that are here, our shared vision of inclusive education. And then we maybe go to a school board meeting and we present that and we request that that becomes school board policy or vision, mission. Um, so, yeah, that action step of developing a shared vision can be really helpful and needed, I think, at the beginning of that change process.
For sure.
Yeah. So we have so many people here. Welcome. And if you're watching the replay, know that you can still come, and make comments and ask questions, because I'll come back and answer them. And so Michelle says, can I get your contact information? So Michelle,
Putting my email address in the chat, so you can please go ahead and just
okay.
put it up there.
All right. Who's
And
gonna
yeah, please contact me. I love having conversations. I love writing emails about inclusive education. I love sharing videos and articles, and I want to hear your stories. So please, find me on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, LinkedIn. Add me on all the things. That's fine. It's absolutely fine.
become his new best friend?
Yeah.
Well, Kim from Iowa had asked a question, and she had asked, what helped influence you when you were a special ed teacher in a self-contained classroom? What helped you change your mindset and, values of how kids can be included in general ed? So do you want to touch on that for a bit?
Yeah, I love talking about this. So, when I first was a special education teacher, I was not an inclusion advocate. I went to Cal State University Fullerton for my teacher training. And that's when I was first exposed to this idea that students with disabilities should be educated, with their typically developing peers. And I was first in a self-contained classroom for students with autism spectrum disorder. And so my professor at the time said, Tim, I want you to create an inclusion plan for one of your students. And she's like, don't pick an easy one. Don't pick an easy situation. Pick a student that you think would never, ever, be included. And I was like, oh, I've got the perfect one, perfect one. So I think I call him Nathan. I've told the story so many times. So let's just go with Nathan. So Nathan was a fifth grader, non-speaking. He didn't have a communication device at the time, but he did use sign language. We use sign language to kind of bring out some of that communication. And so, but he had some significant challenges. And so I was like, this is perfect. Well, he was a fifth grader. So I went to the fifth grade social studies teacher, and I said, I've got Nathan. I want to include him in a social studies activity. What do you got? And she's like, well, we're doing these topography maps. Why don't we do that? And so I spent some time with the fifth grade teacher and planned a lesson around Nathan's strengths. Nathan loved to cut and he loved to rip. He loved to use his hands. He had very strong hands. And so we developed a lesson plan where he would participate in the lesson by cutting out in cardboard the topography levels, right? And so this was a student that had a really hard time focusing, and he was always up and around. And when we went to the class and was able to, he was able to sit and participate in the lesson and be with his peers, and there weren't any, problems. I was like, oh, all you have to do is plan. and so it opened my eyes, and I was like, oh, well, this makes so much sense, because if you just expect students with, significant support needs to be included in a regular class and just expect that to be okay, it's not going to be okay. You have to plan. And so once I realized that, then I was hooked, and I didn't look back.
Cool.
And I consistently grew and grew and grew and grew and grew in my skills and mindset. And there's a lot of other stories in between there. But here I am, very, very fortunate and blessed to be in the position I'm in, being the communication director for MCIE.
Yes. And I think, Tim, you might have some help for us here because of your experience of working with autistic students. And that we had some conversation in our chat today about what about the students that, general ed is just that sensory overload. And so what do we do about that?
Sure. Well, there's a big it depends in there. But where's the question? I think I can pull it up here. No, it's okay. Yeah. I think I can pull it up. Or you
I got it back up here.
So in general, right? Because I do get this. I do get this a lot when I talk about, inclusion and students, in autism and stuff like that. But I think when you're thinking about natural proportions, and we're advocating for authentic inclusive education, it doesn't mean that we're just going to put all the autistic students in a general ed class and you have like 20 kids and 10 students that have autism, right? So we first have to think about how we are supporting students across a grade level, or in a school. But sometimes, right, that's out of our control. So if that is out of our control, and you have to plan for the students that are in your class. And so if that means that you have, 4 students out of your 25 that are students on the spectrum, then how are you going to arrange that class so that they're able to access and participate, feel like they're a member, and learn, right? And there's another misconception, I think, here too, that inclusion means all day, every day, in the same classroom, no matter what. We had a district that we were working with, and they were like, well, this student needs, some extra instruction, and we can't go across the hall to provide that instruction, because that's segregation. And we're like, no, it's okay. It's okay to go somewhere else to provide instruction. It's okay to go somewhere else to provide, support with sensory needs. It's okay. The point is that we're not creating segregated spaces for those students to be all day, right? So if a student needs support with, their sensory integration or self-regulation, and that is in another location in the building, that's okay, because that is how we're supporting all students, right? So I just wanted to make sure, at least, that's how we define,
right,
support for students.
And I think too, like, one of the things that makes a difference for me, so, I have to be honest, when I hear you say, kids can go somewhere else for instruction, it's like, I'm like, really? So,
No, and please, I don't want it to be communicated that it's so like I'm saying a special education classroom, right? Like when we are talking about inclusion, we are advocating that there's no special places, right? That um, but when we're thinking about how instruction is delivered and if that instruction can be delivered in small groups, right? That doesn't necessarily mean that it's small groups in the same classroom all day.
right.
There's a difference. It's nuanced, but there's a difference.
Right. And I think what helps me is, for me to look at how we can re-envision how we use the physical space in our school building, right?
Absolutely.
Um, and that, if it right now, special education classrooms are pretty much only for students on IEPs and the staff that work with them.
Right.
Sometimes schools try to do reverse mainstreaming, which I'm not a fan of, but sometimes they'll have peers in there too. But mainly it's a room for just kids on IEPs. So instead, if we have rooms that are true resource rooms for all the students, because there's more than just kids on IEPs that need some kinds of differences during, different maybe settings during the day, then it's like, yeah, I can get on board with that. My fear is that we still will revert that space to be used mainly for kids on IEPs.
Yeah. Well,
And
think
I look
about.
at it like, go ahead.
Well, I was just gonna just quickly, think about, if you are implementing a multi-tier system of support, and you have students who need more, right?
Right.
They may or may not have an individualized education program, right? So some of those tier two strategies and interventions, those are interventions, right? They don't last forever. So if there's flexible services and flexible interventions, and if we're really utilizing a multi-tier systems of support, it's like, students are up and down that on those tiers and those interventions. So, you're not going to be stuck. And that's the point, is that a lot of times well, this student has 30 minutes of math and they go over there, but it's like
Right.
now they're stuck and
Right.
they're not going to leave.
Yeah, and that's the thing, because that flexible grouping, right, is the
Mm,
key versus like you're always going to be a bluebird and other people are going to be the eagles of the reading group. Um, the other thing I think that can be helpful, especially when we look at, the sensory overload that can happen in different places in the building, is to ask the student and ask their classmates, what could we do differently? Because again, I just see students having so many brilliant ideas that we as adults don't have. And so I would encourage families and teachers to open that discussion to the students in the general ed classroom, as how can we make this different so it's a place
mm.
where we all feel comfortable. So that's, one possibility, I think. And yeah, Samantha was saying things like noise canceling headphones,
Absolutely. Yeah.
seat where there's less visual chaos, design seating, decor so it's not overstimulating. And as a former elementary teacher, we love our bulletin boards and our word walls and all these things, but sometimes that's not going to be the best kind of classroom environment. So yeah, I appreciate that. So, Tim, we are up here at the top of the hour, and I so appreciate your time. And, I'm sure we could go on for additional hours because people appreciate the experience and the background that you have as a special educator. And as you have evolved to different, jobs and responsibilities and roles that you have, and appreciate that vision that now working for the Maryland Coalition for Inclusive Education and getting a chance to work with school districts. So you have such insight that many of us don't have. There was a question, and I think you should be like, those maps for Hollywood houses, and you buy a map for $1 and you get to see where all the celebrities live. You could sell a map of school districts. And
Yeah.
actually, I think, didn't you have a recent blog with somebody looking at a map? So I think Kristen from Ohio wants to know, what are those magical school districts where this is actually happening?
So, that's a really interesting question. So where are the inclusive schools? Let me tell you that that's still a question that we are trying to answer. But two that I have said consistently publicly is Cecil County School District in Maryland and Westland Wilsonville near Portland, Oregon. And I'm very confident in saying both of those because they've both gone through systemic change, and they've sustained that change. And they are both actually, if you look at their LREA numbers, it's over 90% of the students with IEPs for 80% or more of their day. So, and again, that's just the number. But when you look at the practices that they have, it's everything that we've talked about. So there is no, and just in case anyone was wondering, there is no list. There's no list. If somebody tells you that they've got a list,
we can set up a moving van
in New Jersey.
Everybody move to Oregon.
Well, that is one of the things that when I wrote the weekly-ish post, I had a number of people email me like, Tim, what are you doing? If you say them out loud, people are going to want to move there. So, which I think, so that's one of the things that I think Cecil County and Westland Wilsonville are prepared, that might happen. And that's another reason why you don't just want to say, XYZ district and XYZ state is quote unquote inclusive, because they may not be prepared to do that. So we are actually in the middle. I just have a few more minutes, Charmaine, if that's okay.
Yes.
We are working on a project where we're so close to being able to announce it. But I think people who are interested in what inclusive schools look like and sound like, I think you're going to be really interested in this project. So stay tuned.
Stay tuned. There's more. The other caution I have for you, for our viewers, is if the superintendent changes, guess what? The whole culture of the district can change. So don't necessarily pack your bags for Oregon right yet.
Right. And I think, even, Jennifer Spencer Imes, who wrote the book Leading for All, about their district change, she was a guest on the podcast over a year ago. And I think everyone in this business of inclusion knows exactly what you said, Charmaine. It matters who is leading, right? So hopefully we have districts that are committed to that, committed to inclusive education for the long term. But you never know, right?
Right.
Yeah.
Well, thank you so much, Tim. And I will be compiling the show notes and listing the tools and resources that Tim shared today in my newsletter. If you don't get my weekly newsletter, you can sign up at iep.today/weekly adv tips, and you will get the newsletter tomorrow also. But Tim, I just appreciate your time and all the work that you and Carol are doing. And also a little secret, Carol Quirk is going to be a guest on the show on May 5th. So everybody come back for more wonderful news of, and maybe will your project be ready? Can Carol announce it? Do you think on May 5th?
We should be able to announce it by then.
Ooh,
If
okay.
you're on our email list, you might even hear about it before then.
Oh, good. So stop over at mci.org. They have lots of resources. They also have the links for where Tim is. And we will see you next Thursday. Next Thursday, I'm going to be talking about things I used to say and give us suggestions as an advocate, and things I figured out that's not such a good idea, Charmaine. So I'll be calling out myself next week and sharing my mistakes that I've made. So come back and join us. Tim, have a wonderful afternoon, and thank you again for being with us.
Of course.
See you later.